We've been talking quite a bit about aphids, but they are one of the more common insects you're going to encounter on all sorts of fruits, vegetables, other edible crops, as well as ornamentals. And the previous discussion was on the kinds of things that they may do to plants. But now I want to move into how we might manage them, and the situation, of course, will vary depending on what you're trying to manage. Are you trying to prevent a contamination problem? Is it just some nuisance problems with honeydew? Are you having a leaf curl? So the response will vary depending on what your situation is, but basically there are four common situations that involve aphids, and they would have fairly similar responses. And the first one is by far the most common, where all you have are some aphids that are on the plant, exposed, maybe in high number, and you're concerned about this. What do you do about that? Well, it kind of depends. There's all sorts of different levels of control response you may consider. The first one would be to do nothing, because natural controls will likely ultimately take care of things. This is not the situation indoors. That's very different. So if you're talking about aphids in greenhouses or interior production facilities, then that's a very different situation, and that requires a different response. But outdoors, which is what we're talking about generally, another thing you might consider is just trying to hose them off. And even indoors, that could be a possible management approach. You could knock these off. We could use soapy water. Soaps, insecticidal soaps, are a product that is widely used for aphid control. Or there are a great many other things that work quite well for aphids in this kind of situation. But outdoors, let's talk about the natural controls, because outdoors, aphids are almost always controlled well by natural enemies. There's a robust group of natural enemies that will work on them in most situations. So before you consider controlling aphids in some vegetable crop, fruit crop, do check for the activity of aphid natural enemies, because it could be that they are just at the cusp of turning the situation around without your interventions. So, as an example, all right, it's kind of a complicated picture we have here of an aphid that is actually a fairly pretty aphid that occurs on sunflowers and milkweed, but regardless, a lot of them. And if you had a lot of aphids in this kind of situation, you might be concerned if it was some plant that you were trying to grow. Well, on this leaf, with what we see, is this a problem that we need to deal with? No, I would say that there's some things that are happening on this leaf that indicate that this is going to be taken care of by natural controls. So, for instance, this little arrow indicates an aphid that looks a little bit different. So, what's the situation with that? Well, if you remember, there are these wasps, these aphid parasitoids, these wasps that attack aphids, insert their eggs into developing aphids, and as the aphid develops, it is consumed internally by the developing wasp larva, and it becomes an aphid mummy. It becomes distended, enlarged, often discolored, and quite conspicuous. So that's what we see in that picture. So again, aphid mummies that were the larva was developing within that aphid, and the adult wasp will come out, leaving some sort of little trap door. And again, we talked about that in the first section in 356A. There are two other things in this picture, though, too, that are of importance, and these two are indicated by the black arrows. And what might those be? Well, they're lady beetle larvae. Lady beetle larvae are of course, predators of a great many kinds of insects, including aphids, and the larvae are the most important predatory stage of this group of familiar insects. A developing lady beetle larva, depending on how old it is, might be feeding on a dozen, may be feeding on 100 aphids per day. So, if I look at this picture, where I see lots of aphids, I also see a good number of natural enemies. And I will be highly confident that in a very short period of time, a couple of days, the situation on this leaf will be totally turned around. There's a lot of lady beetle action, the parasitic wasps are coming in, and this is a leaf that, even though it has a lot of aphids, will, if left undisturbed, will resolve itself to the effects of natural enemies. And then there are things you could do in a garden situation outdoors that might increase the activity of these natural enemies. And one of the most important is to promote habitat diversity. And there are different ways you can improve habitat diversity, but the simplest, I think, is just to promote the expanded use of the resources that are needed by the adult stages of insects that feed on aphids that develop as aphid natural enemies. Things like lady beetles, things like lacewings, things like flower flies, things like certain parasitic wasps. All of these are insects that sustain themselves on nectar and or pollen in the adult form. And the provision of these kinds of flowers in and around a planting will provide resources that will allow these natural enemies to be more effective, to work more efficiently, and to provide a higher level of biological control. So that's something anybody could do. Increase diversity in your garden by promoting the kinds of plants that the adult stages of these natural enemies feed on, and these are specifically flowering plants that provide nectar and pollen, but flowering plants of a specific structure, and that would be that they are small and have accessible nectaries. So they might be something like sweet alyssum, they might be dill, or they might have some sort of umbel form, some sort of broad form with lots of little flowers. But those are the kinds of things that, if you have them in and around your garden planting, you will be able to promote the adult stage food needs for natural enemies that will then work on aphids. Now, in the greenhouse, if you got aphid problems indoors, none of these natural enemies exist. And so it's a totally different situation. But there are a large number of natural enemies that are available, and one of the handouts that's provided for this class gives you some of the sources of these biological control agents that you might consider introducing into a indoor greenhouse situation. Green lacewings would be a group of insects you might consider as the eggs in an interior scape. But more commonly used are the ones that are indicated here. There are several kinds of wasps that attack various kinds of aphids that are common in greenhouses. Kill them, turn them into mummies. You can purchase these, introduce them, and if things go well, they will reproduce, and you won't have to purchase additional numbers of them. They'll establish. There's not a good source of flower flies or syrphid flies, but there is of something called the aphid predator midge, and that's indicated in the lower right picture. It's a kind of a predator that is quite small and about the size of an aphid, but can be highly effective in aphid control, and that's in the commercial trade of biological control organisms. And there are some fungi. Bovaria bassiana is the most commonly available, but there are some other fungi as well that are sold to control aphids within interior scapes and in greenhouses. So, do nothing, let the natural controls ultimately take care of things, or maybe supplement them, but let's go into the second thing that we might consider. Treat the plants with a strong jet of water. And this may seem pretty simplistic, but it can work. It doesn't take much to kill an aphid. She's not very well defended. She is also not particularly well built, and a good jet of water will, if nothing else, just rip her off the plant, and those long, thin mouth parts that are trailing into the plant will be ripped out as well, but you might break a few limbs, and aphids don't recover well from this. And if they're off the plant, then their chances of surviving are poor. Now, there are two things to remember here. One is that aphids cannot orient very well So once they're off a plant, it'll be very difficult for them to get back on a plant. They can't smell. They're just pretty much randomly walking around. But also, and more important, the only thing that any individual aphid can survive on is a specific kind of a host plant. So you knock some aphids off a tomato and they happen to get on your cabbage, well, they're not going to live on the cabbage. Cabbage isn't a food. Tomatoes their food. You knock them off bean plants and they get on to pepper. Bean is their host and pepper is not. They wouldn't recognize it. So there's no concern about getting them to be moving to a different kind of plant if you do this. We have, again, over 350 different kinds of aphids in the state, and they're usually very specific in terms of the kinds of plants they're going to feed on. You knock them off one plant, they're not going to move and successfully establish on a second kind of very different plant. So, as an example, I mean, just in my yard, a little out of focus here, but a bunch of aphids on my roses. Little jet of water. Not very many aphids. It can work. It doesn't take much to knock off many aphids. There may be some that survive, but 3, 4, 5 days later you do it again and keep it back. And this has a minimal impact on natural enemies, can have a very effective impact on reducing the number of aphids so that then natural enemies that then move in and try to finish off the rest can then have a more rapid response to terminating that problem. And there are various kinds of products we can use. The kinds of things we use for aphid control on exposed aphids in food crops in a garden situation are fairly limited. Insecticidal soaps are one of them. Azadirachtin, the active ingredient in neem, not neem oil, but azadirachtin. Pyrethrins, a natural product that comes from the flowers of pyrethrum, usually sold in combination with an oil, which also can assist in control. Or we can use some of the synthetic insecticides such as permethrin, a pyrethrin's derivative, or acetamiprid in some of the vegetable crops and fruit crops is one of the systemic insecticides in the nicotinoid class that is now on the market. But insecticidal soaps are probably the simplest and easiest to use. They're used typically as about a 2% dilution with water, and if applied to an exposed aphid, usually will be able to control a high percentage of them. On the other hand, insecticidal soaps are not pure. They will affect some of the exposed natural enemies, but the impact of insecticidal soaps is strictly on an insect that is exposed to the spray when you apply it. So plants that have been sprayed by soaps can be readily recolonized by adults of lady beetles and the like. So insecticidal soaps are probably one of the more common things that we might use for aphids, but there are again some other products on the market, the azadirachtin, the pyrethrins, some of the synthetic pyrethrins, and other products. Now, sometimes we have a situation with aphids where they're producing a spring leaf curl. This is a situation almost entirely associated with some of our tree fruits. And the situation also involves an insect that is wintering as eggs on the plant. So we have curls in the spring, but the stage that is surviving through the winter is an egg that's going to hatch in the spring. And this is where oils come in. Horticultural oils. Oils have been used for well over 150 years to control insects. They work primarily by smothering, and one of the more important uses for horticultural oils would be to smother insects that spend the winter in a stage that can be smothered, and that would include aphids as a big group. So fruit crops that have spring problems with aphids are often routinely treated with horticultural oils. Now, this kind of application can be quite effective for the insect. The other advantage of spring applications or winter applications, dormant season applications of horticultural oils before bud break, is that the natural enemies are not active at this time, and certainly not the pollinators, because the plants are dormant. So this can be a highly effective and very selective way to use insecticides. So again, the kind of thing we're talking about would be one of these aphids that have the holocyclic life cycle, let's say, and like a green peach aphid that is surviving the winter as an egg, and if we were to spray an oil before the egg hatches, and that egg would hatch more or less coincident with the time of bud break, if we were to spray before that time with an oil, that egg would be covered with the oil. It would kill the egg, so the egg wouldn't hatch. So if the egg doesn't hatch, then you don't get the stem mother, which is the form that emerges from that egg. If you don't get the stem mother, you don't get the progeny that the stem mother will produce, and then you don't get the leaf curl. So the use of dormant season applications of oils to control eggs of aphids on fruit trees is pretty standard. But again, it'd be appropriate for an insect that winters in the egg stage and causes spring leaf curl, and not all of them do. But horticultural oils would be a kind of product that works on this overwintering stage and has some activity in addition after the eggs have hatched, but mostly we move on to some other products after the eggs have hatched. Aphid control scenario 3 is if you have aphids that winter as eggs on an herbaceous perennial plant. Now, we use it. This would be a sanitation situation, and what I mean by an herbaceous perennial plant would be one that is perennial, so it will come back the next year, but the top growth dies. And aphids in this kind of situation are going to lay overwintering eggs in a cold climate like this on a perennial plant, but the perennial plant itself dies, but will return next spring as new shoots. So sanitation works here because the old eggs, or the eggs that will set up the situation for the new year, are laid in fall on the stems of the plants in the previous fall. Set up a situation in spring are set up in the previous fall by laying eggs on the stalks at that time. And what I mean by herbaceous perennial plants, a lot of these are flowers. It could be lupins, it could be columbine, it could be asters, but it could be asparagus as well. And these are kinds of perennial plants that are herbaceous, that die down during the winter, that have aphid issues, often in at least some parts of this state. And so what we do would be to remove the plant debris with these eggs prior to when eggs are going to hatch in spring. Now the eggs are going to hatch sometime after the new shoots come up in spring. So what we want to do is get rid of the old debris that harbors the eggs from the previous fall before the new growth comes up. And that's what's being done here. Scenario 4 is the situation where aphids have produced a leaf curl. Now, this is a problem if the leaf curl has already been established. Our control options have been diminished. We don't have a great many options, and in some cases we really don't have any options. But the only option that would work on an insect that has already curled the leaf is an insecticide, use of an insecticide that is systemic. The contact insecticides that work by being put on the body of an insect, such as a soap, are not able to control an insect that's curled some of the leaves and is protected. We just can't get to them. So your option are the use of systemic insecticides or nothing. Now a systemic insecticide is one that can move in the plant, and then it could move to sites so that an aphid, in this case, that has curled a leaf would ingest some of the insecticide and be killed. There are actually a couple of systemic insecticides that are labeled for use on some edible crops. The two on the market with some registrations have active ingredients imidacloprid or acetamiprid. Both of these are in the neonicotinoid class. Now, there are extremely important notes. I mean, this is not an option for many kinds of crops. And the important notes is, for one thing, it's very hard to find a product that is labeled to be used on a food crop that is systemic. There are more, frankly, in commercial formulations of these insecticides, but over the counter, very few. And those that do have a label, that do allow use on edible crops, allow use on only a couple edible crops. So you have to be really careful in terms of choosing a product that is allowed to be used on that crop if you go this route. So, in summary, the kinds of ways we might manage aphids in a yard, garden, typical fruit, vegetable situation can vary depending on how we wish to go at it. We might wish to do nothing, allow the natural controls, or maybe assist the activity of these natural controls. We might hit them periodically with a strong jet of water, use soaps or detergents, or go after them with some kind of other product that's effective against aphids.